Hello, my name's Tony Morbin. I'm Editor-in-Chief at SC Media UK. Today I'm joined by Chris Bailey, Vice President, Strategy and Business Development at Entrust Datacard. We're going to be talking about how new European regulations can either cost you or make you millions. So Chris, what is eIDAS and how does it differ from GDPR?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me. But eIDAS and GDPR are different. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation, and it basically regulates the way organizations hold data securely and privately for EU citizens. And it comes with a very hefty fine if organizations don't comply to those regulations, including a 20 million euro fine or up to 4% of global revenues. eIDAS is different. eIDAS stands for the Electronic Identification, Authentication, and Trust Services. It basically provides a mechanism, a legal framework for organizations to move from paper transactions to digital transactions. And what that means for companies is they can move all their paper transactions so they can save money and time, but also they can actually come up with new methodologies, new business models to increase their opportunities with their customers.
Digitally signed documents must be easier to forge than physical documents and access to them as well. So how do we ensure the integrity of the data in them?
Paper documents and digital documents aren't really more secure or less secure than one another. It really depends on how we actually secure them. You can imagine some documents are very secure. They have 24-hour lock and key or even guards around them. Those documents would be secure. But digital transactions also need a level of specificity, a level of standards and security around them in order to make sure that they at least meet some level of security. And the eIDAS model has defined many of these specifications, including the identification process of who signs what, how it's signed, how it's stored, when the document's signed, etc. And these standards actually allow for us to have that similar legal framework between the paper transactions and the digital transactions. And that's what's unique about eIDAS.
I mean, now under open banking, we also have to have interoperability of these services. So what are the risks there?
Well, the risks are a little bit different with banking. In fact, there's a new directive that the EU has passed called PSD2, a Payment Service Directive 2. And it requires banks to enable access of their banking information to financial industries. And other banks or other financial institutions can access that data and actually show all customers' banking information in a single portal. In order to make that happen, this PSD2 framework has described what banks need to do, including some of the things would be having their websites go through a verification process that's very secure. Another one would be having the information being signed that's also considered very secure. And what I mean by secure is the encryption technologies around that, but also the identification. This information is strongly identified so that the banks and other participating institutions can be assured that they're talking to the correct institution. And then, of course, there's a two-factor authentication process that individuals have to use when they log into these portals to make sure that they're getting the right data, not someone else's data. So this has all been thought out, and the legal framework for PSD2 is not just an advantage for organizations that want to be proactive with this, but it's also a requirement that will have penalties if banks don't comply. And the penalties will actually go into effect maybe as soon as December 31st of next year.
So with this growth, what are the main concerns we should have around digital ID, and what are the main things we can do to reduce the risk?
Well, the eIDAS framework does a good job of explaining what needs to be done, but in principle, everything that has to occur is everything in the transaction has to be identified. Where you're getting this document from, who's actually signing the document, and also the document itself has to have what's called integrity. It can't be changed or modified. You have to know when it was signed. And when you actually combine all these materials together, all these principles together, you do get a strong transaction. So you can trust that the digital transaction is just as good, or in many cases better from a security perspective than a paper transaction.
So will it still impact UK organisations if Brexit does happen and we're no longer bound by EU regulations?
Well, that's a very good question. So I don't want to speculate on what will happen with Brexit, but I can tell you from a regulatory scenario that because the GDPR regulations are related to the EU citizen, companies that operate even at arm's reach, in EU territory are going to have to abide by those regulations. So even companies that don't do business in the EU are still potentially liable if they don't actually control how they manage this data. So they're going to be up for these penalties regardless of whether Brexit happens or not. With the eIDAS regulation, really that framework allows them to do these legal transactions in the EU. So if they're doing business in the EU, they're going to want to actually perform these types of transactions. Furthermore, if let's say there's a complete hard Brexit and there is no regulatory compliance in the UK that would look like the eIDAS regulation, well, it's likely that there'll be some form that will look very similar, if not the exact same thing, because it's becoming more and more of an international standard outside the EU. So I think that there will be at least some form of the eIDAS in the UK, regardless of Brexit.
Chris, thanks for some really great insight there, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tony.